Gosh, I'm not really sure I can live up to the introduction, but anyway, I shall do my best. We are all, really, aren't we, let's be truthful, contemplating a wake. That's to say that the longest lasting party in the Western world is manifestly on its last legs. Would anybody really disagree? And what I would like to do this evening is to investigate how this has happened and how we can perhaps reverse it. It's a long and interesting story, and it's a really good thing that we're doing it in a historic room like this. Because, of course, for all those of us who've got any interest in history or Britain or anything else, one of the great sadnesses, certainly for me, of a lifetime, is how things have just slipped away. Things that we took for granted, that seemed stable, that seemed just part of the world, have...
Your glasses of wine look like the Leaning Tower of Pisa.
There is a ridge. That is, everybody was looking very anxiously at it, I thought. I couldn't make up my mind whether it was envy or the thought, how are we going to get through this man without one of these things or whatever it was. Anyway, it's now almost as stable as the Conservative Party. There we are. There we are. I used to be very good at this kind of thing, right. And there is just that sense, isn't there, of that fragility and disappearance. I don't think it's inevitable. I do think it can be halted. In my wildly optimistic moments, I think it can be reversed. So what I'll do is I will trace why it happens, why we're in the mess that we are now. I will offer a precedent that gives us some hope, who's called Margaret Thatcher, because we are literally rerunning the 1970s. There's a 50-year gap. It's a half century and we're running them. We are rerunning them. And then I will try and give a detailed account of exactly what it is we're fighting and why it's so dangerous. Let's begin right at the beginning. You were going back very conveniently to the 1830s. And you were talking about the slave trade. Obviously, that time of the third decade of the 19th century is one of extraordinary change. And one of the most extraordinary changes is our invention. Remember, when people talk about the Conservative Party as going back 300 years, they're wrong. The Conservative Party, and I'm sure somebody here will give me the exact date. What is the date that the Conservative Party, the actual use of the term conservative, enters our political vocabulary? Tamworth Manifesto of 1835, with the probably our most intelligent ever Prime Minister, Sir Robert Peel, formulating it. Peel, again, this is a very interesting sign, the staggering difference between now and then. We look at our politicians now. You look at Starmer, you know, an A and a B and a C at A level in a selective school, isn't it? You look at Robert Peel, a double first, the top first, because in those days firsts were actually not simply first, they were ranked in order in both mathematics and classics at Oxford. People of staggering intelligence. Anyway, Peel is responsible for the Tamworth Manifesto, which invents the word conservative, invents the term Conservative Party. And I think it tells us a huge amount about what our fundamental problem is and always has been. Because the Tamworth Manifesto begins by accepting defeat. Of course it does. It accepts the Great Reform Act of 1832, which is the end of the Tory party. the Tory party, the party of king and church, ends in 1832. How could it do anything else? You'd had Catholic emancipation in 1830, which had broken the bond between the Church of England and membership of the political nation. With the reforms forced through by the Whigs in 1832, you'd broken the old constitution. So the Conservative Party begins, this is the key thing to understand, it begins, when you talk about a Conservative Party, obviously the idea is you resist change, right? Can we be clear? Isn't that why we're here? Don't we actually think too much change is probably a bad thing? That it's quite important that things that have lasted for 800 or 900 years, there's probably a reason, isn't there? They're not just to be junked like worn-out underwear. You know, they might be there for a purpose, that things that are new are not better by definition than things... I mean, what else does it mean? But we begin by accepting change. And you can see Peel. Yes, unequivocally, we accept the Great Reform Act, but then you've got the terrible problem, which is, why then do you resist any other change at all? Why don't you just roll over? And you can see he's trying to grope for, you say, oh, the fact that we've accepted this absolutely major fundamental change, which has destroyed the previous basis on which I've stood in politics. You know, that's what he's saying. He's then, well, where do we stand? And you can see, finally, he doesn't know. Which is why, of course, Peel finds himself destroying the Conservative Party by advocating the Corn Laws. The repeal of the Corn Laws, which at that point you destroy the agricultural interest, you lead to the Great Depression, and so on and so on and so on, and 30 years of liberal hegemony in the mid-19th century. So conservatism is this, are we all getting the point that I'm getting at? That the fact that you can see how conservatism has constantly compromised because it doesn't have, unless you're very careful, and I'll come up in a moment with somebody I think who does it better, a foundational doctrine. Is anybody familiar with the work of Friedrich Hayek? Right, great, okay. Hayek's most important book in the area we're looking at now is called The Constitution of Liberty. And he's looking at, essentially, why countries become free and free market economics. And of course, have free market economics. And of course, the pioneer country in all of this is us. Remember, the key thing to understand is this country, which is foundationally conservative, is the one that leads the way to modernity. There's this extraordinary paradox that it is us, not the progressive consciously progressive continental countries like Louis XIV's France, you know, with extraordinary sophisticated ministers like Colbert and Vauban and all the rest of it. It's us who actually create a modern economy, create a modern science, create a modern culture, not the self-consciously reforming rationalist French. But there is then this extraordinary paradox, and you can see in Hayek's book his quest for how all this works out. Now, some of you may remember that Margaret Thatcher, in the days of her glory, is supposed to have entered the Centre for Policy Studies and slapped down...
The research department.
That's correct, you're better than I am. Conservative Research Department is supposed to have slapped down, headed by that, by the awful Chris Patton, that absolute nest of, you clearly are well informed, that nest of wet vipers. And she is supposed, you would not disagree with that, I take it, and slapped down Hayek on the table, having extracted from her handbag, in which case it's a very, very large handbag, because it's a very, very big book. But there is a great problem. The last chapter says why I am not a conservative. And what Hayek's argument is, there is no serious doctrine. Now, I want finally to challenge that idea and to come up with an alternative. But it's important, let's bear these two facts in mind. First, that conservatism begins with the exact acceptance of the opposite of what it is, change. And secondly, that there's an absence of a demonstrable philosophical or conceptual doctrine. Okay? Are we all happy with where we're going so far? Right. Let's take this then forward and look at, I think, the person who, even with all Robert Peel's brilliance and intelligence, I think is the real founder of the Conservative Party, and the person who actually squares this circle that we're talking about. It's Benjamin Disraeli. And Disraeli, of course, is responsible for the next great Reform Act, the Reform Act of 1867, which gives the vote, not simply the 1832 Act had broadly given it to the educated, prosperous citizens of towns, roughly the liberal elite. What Disraeli does in 1867 is to give it to my ancestors, the skilled working men, the cotton workers of Lancashire, and I'm sure the wool workers around here, and everything else. And Disraeli accompanies that with an astonishing speech, which he gives in Edinburgh. There are later versions of it in 1872 at Crystal Palace and so on, and the Free Trade Hall in Manchester. But we'll concentrate on the Liverpool speech, on the Edinburgh speech. And remember, I'm here with you in this nice little room, and I've got my tilting glass of red wine. How did Disraeli cope with a speech in those vast buildings like the Free Trade Hall? No amplification. He did it with 2 bottles of brandy. I feel I've been very short-changed, but there we are. It probably adds to the degree of comprehension. Anyway, what Disraeli says in 1867 is very remarkable. Listen to it carefully. He says first, Britain is a progressive country, and in a progressive country, change is inevitable. And if you look in all the dictionaries of quotations, the quote stops there. In a progressive country, change is inevitable. In other words, Disraeli becomes the founding Tory wet, the origin of one nation in its perverted sense, the kind of origin of, fatty now, slimmy Soames and all that kind of thing. Right. But he doesn't stop there. He goes on and I think gives you the proper ground of discrimination. He goes as follows. Change is inevitable. The question is what sort of change? And then he discriminates. Is it change in accordance, we're here in an example of it, the traditions, the history, the nature, the behavior of the country? And he argued, correctly it turns out, that the enfranchising of the working man, as indeed later on the enfranchising of women. I was talking before at lunchtime at the Army and Navy Club, which is the corner of a hideous building, terrible 60s thing, on the site of a very fine building at the corner of the entrance to St James's Square and Pall Mall, and on the northern side of Pall Mall, the northern side of St James's Square, as you're going up from Pall Mall, there is what is now the In and Out Club. It's moved, and the in and out is in the house that was lived in by our very first female MP, Nancy Astor, which shows you just how completely conventional the beneficiaries of female franchise were. The idea that the suffragettes were radical, I mean, you go and look there, it's one of the grandest, richest, most gilded and luxurious houses in London, and she's the first beneficiary of it. So again, very much in accordance with the traditions of the country. And then he goes on and says, what is the sort of change we don't want? In accordance with rootless cosmopolitan liberalism. Rootless, arbitrary, cosmopolitan liberalism. And ladies and gentlemen, that seems to me to be exactly what conservatives should have remembered and exactly what they forgot repeatedly. Because what we got in 1997 with Blair was a slow burn French Revolution bringing to Britain, superimposing on us all those things that a generation before, 1830, Edmund Burke had railed against in his reflections on the French Revolution, abstract, rootless ideas that simply seemed, like the idea, we've sort of ignored how completely silly the metric system is. I mean, we just have a fragment of the metric system. The metric system was there were going to be 10 days in the week, there were going to be 10 hours in the day, there were going to be 10 months in the year, completely demented. Every single geographical area in France was redone to make it the same dimensions as every other area. Completely mad. It was a mad rationalism. And what Blair did is fundamentally that. So we failed at the moment of challenge. We failed to apply the one serious piece of analysis which is available to the conservative. But we can draw consolation because we've been here before. We've repeatedly made the mistake and the party has actually recovered. Are you all aware this is the 50th anniversary of Margaret Thatcher's election as leader of the Conservative Party? Margaret Thatcher in 1975 was hopeless. She was probably the worst Secretary of State for Education we've ever had, and closed more grammar schools, I know. We were talking about Anthony Crosland and the horrors of all of this beforehand. She is mere putty in the hands of her civil servants. What happens? There is a Damascene conversion. Margaret Thatcher is changed to this absolutely useless figure into one of the very greatest of our prime ministers by a man. You know, there's a usual joke, and ladies all preen themselves. Behind a strong man, there's a stronger woman. In Margaret Thatcher's case, behind a strong woman, there was a much cleverer man, and it's called Keith Joseph. And what Keith Joseph did was to have a Damascene conversion. Now, Damascene conversions, particularly when they relate to Robert Jenrick, are now rather questioned. I would like to remind everybody that the original Damascene conversion of St. Paul was actually quite effective. That's to say, St. Paul really does invent Christianity, much more than Jesus did, in fact. Jesus is the example. St. Paul comes up with the ideas. No, the whole fabric of Christian theology is essentially Paul. Well, it's true. It's Pauline. You may shake your head as much as you like, but it's true. And certainly, if you're a member of the Church of England and the 39 Articles, they're entirely based on Pauline Christianity. Anyway, going back to what I really know about, as opposed to as an atheist, an amateur interest in theology, the Damascene conversion of Keith Joseph in 1973-74, he responds to the failure of the Heath government. Because remember, the Heath government fails catastrophically. It's defeated by the first miners' strike. Heath goes to the country, asks the question, who governs England? And I remember I voted with the majority. It was anybody but you. Because, of course, remember, the Heath government had done exactly what Liz Truss did. Barbour, as Chancellor of the Exchequer, triggers a boom that makes what Truss did look minor. Many of you here are my sort of age. Does anybody remember what the increase of property prices in London in 72, 73 in response to the Barbour inflated boom was? Anybody?
The average inflation rate is about 30%.
Do you know how much property prices went up in London? They go up 3 times in 1 year. That's when a government really collapses, right? And the Damascene conversion then is Keith Joseph saying, I'd call myself a conservative. I now know I hadn't been a conservative. I'd been a member of a conservative government that had done nothing conservative. So we've been here before. And I think it's really important to understand the disaster of post-war Britain. I think we need again to start being honest about how awful the Attlee government was, the catastrophe of creating an NHS and a system of state welfare entirely unfunded on a bankrupt wartime economy. It was deranged. It's a completely mad thing to do. And what does Churchill do in 51? Sweet FA. Absolutely nothing. And instead, we all know the words now, we use them. It is the problem about this analysis. It is the same as you will find in the vulgarest thing online, but it happens to be true. We talk about the uni party now. There is a uni party, and back in the 40s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, there was a thing called Butskellism. So you had Hugh Gaitskell, Winchester, the leader of the Labour Party who never becomes Prime Minister, and you had Rab Butler, was he Eton? I can't remember where he was, but anyway, who was the radical conservative. They all believe in the same thing. They believe in Keynesian economics. They believe in nationalisation. They believe in prices and incomes policies. They believe in 5-year plans. They believe in a fully socialised state. Macmillan absolutely at the heart of this process as well. And it all hits the buffers in the early 1970s, and you get Thatcher coming along, and you get the reinvention of conservatism. Rah, rah, rah. But ladies and gentlemen, it's a terrible problem. Thatcher reinvents conservatism simply as free market economics. Nothing else, and it's not. Free market economics is, yes, it's a product, as Hayek's stuff demonstrates, but the free market economics is created by this profound series of ideas of self-government, of responsibility, of rooted law, of tradition, of this world in a building like this that we're in now. All of that was forgotten. And that forgetting is a very terrible thing. Because remember, look at the most famous thing that Robert Peel did, which is the foundation of the police force. Our police force. What's peculiar about it? It is, unlike anywhere else in Europe or in America, that the police, though they now like to call themselves a force and adopt pseudo-military dress, were deliberately designed not to be that. They had a uniform that was intended to make them ridiculous from the very beginning. The funny hat, the term constable. There was determination they were not to be a military force. They were a civilian force. They were unarmed deliberately because this idea of policing by consent. You can only have policing by consent in a country as we used to be, where laws were yours. The fundamental principle of England, the thing on which everything else rests, going right back to Magna Carta and the century after that, is the idea you determine your laws. That's to say that the law is not handed down from on high, not handed down from Europe, not derived from God. The law is what you as a people, acting through your representatives in Parliament, make it. And again, the idea somehow that government answers to the governed. That's the essential history of England. This is why everywhere in the world has got a parliament, this funny Anglo-Norman word. We set that model, that idea of self-government to the world. And that seems to me to be the fundamental thing. And that's why Peel comes up with this idea. And all that was forgotten by Thatcher. Anyway, Thatcher triumphs, sort of, though of course she begins the terrible process of deindustrialization, whose awful consequences we are now reaping so bitterly. But then, as we know, Thatcher is succeeded in 1997 by Tony Blair, with one of the central intelligences in all of this. I was talking with some of you about it beforehand, Peter Mandelson, Petey, as he's known to his friends. And Petey, you will remember, had this wonderful phrase to describe what it was all about. We are completely happy with people being, and he put with delighted glee the emphasis on the adjective, people being filthy rich, providing they pay their taxes. And you will remember Margaret Thatcher in 2002 says, the great tribute to my success is that my policies have been adopted by the Labour Party. Tony Blair is the great tribute to my success. But ladies and gentlemen, that was a blind. That was simply a front. Because in 1997, you begin a process in which we have effectively a slow burn French Revolution, in which the structures that I've described now that centre on that notion of a nation giving laws to itself are deliberately overlaid by something absolutely, radically different and contradictory. And we need to understand that. And we need to understand how completely it's perverted how we are governed, and why even those who believe in it, like Keir Starmer, can't actually make it work.